Hi everybody, we're starting chapter 31 in this lesson, and this is finally, the introduction to the perfect system in Greek. So I know a lot of people taking this course online will have had some Latin in the past. It's often common to study Latin before Greek, and you've probably been waiting for this moment for a long time because the Latin perfect does a whole lot of work in the Latin language, in part because they don't have the aorist. So in Latin, the perfect system is really standing in for two systems in two potential systems in the language, the aorist and the perfect. So when we talk about Greek perfect, for all of you Latinists out there, I want you to kind of forget about this macro category, which we've already been seeing in our translations with aorist, and open your mind to a kind of more narrow definition of what the perfect is. And to do that, we're going to take a quick moment to explain. So something that may have come up in some of the earlier lessons but became very important in the second half, kind of chapters 15 on, is the difference between an aspect and a tense in a language. So a tense, most properly speaking, and I'm taking kind of simplistic definitions here to make the distinction clear because there's some debate about certain parts of language that linguists even today say, well, is that an aspect or a tense that we're really talking about? But let's go to the essence of these things. A tense has to deal with time. That's really its primary function. So we can have past, present, or future. That's an easy way to divide time. I mean, time is a complex subject, right? Everyone knows exactly what it is, but if I were to ask you to truly define it, it becomes a little bit tricky. But to break it up into these three parts is a classic way to do it. It's not the only way to do it. One could imagine a more complex system where we have a present and then we have a near past, maybe, past 48 hours, something like that. And then what we might call like a deep past, which would be more than 48 hours. Or we might have the same thing projected in the future, something that's about to happen versus something. That would all be things that languages and certain languages do. And they would be doing that under the guise of what linguists would be calling tense, dealing with this time. Aspect, we've come across this primarily so far in our distinction between aorist and present subjunctives and optatives, where the aorist was standing in for something that we were calling simple, where the present would be more progressive. And we would also say, well, the progressive, that's like the imperfect, because in terms of tense, both aorist and imperfect are past tenses, right? They're talking about things that have already happened, but the imperfect was talking about things that used to happen repeatedly versus a simple action in the aorist. So we've already seen some of these distinctions between aspect and tense. So when we get to the perfect tense, the perfect system, and again, we're going to be calling this a tense, the perfect, but it's really all about aspect. So when I'm calling it a perfect tense, that's fine, and that's what everyone calls it, but let's just imagine that there are scare quotes on this term, all right? That tense, we really mean aspect. This distinction about the actual quality of the verb. All right. How can we explain that a little bit more clearly? Let's do it visually. So let me get a kind of neutral color and draw an X and a Y axis. This isn't math, no, this isn't a Khan Academy math video. This is still Greek, but I want to set this, so we've got this axis, the x-axis, goes between past and future, and this is a representation of time. I'm going to call the y-axis, the up and down, t equals 0. So this is really our t-axis, our time axis. And when time equals 0, that's present time relative, I should say, to the utterance. All right. This is getting a little bit linguistic terminology here. So another way that we could call t equals 0 and what people say is time of utterance. Because, okay, we have a present tense. I am happy. I am happy. That's great. Now, if you are here with me in the room as I'm recording this in 2014, this is present tense. But you're watching this video, maybe this year, maybe in 2016, maybe deep into the future, and you're not me right now at this moment. This I am happy is for you in the past. You would say, no, Al at that time of doing this video was happy. You would cast this in the past tense. So rather than set up an absolute time frame where this y-axis, the t equals 0, is always the present, we're saying no, it's present when it's spoken. That's a nice kind of way to mark it. And that's what we're calling the time of utterance. So we've got the time of utterance at 0. That's the present from the perspective of the speaker. So if we had a present tense, let me do this in yellow. When we use the present tense in a language, we could be talking about something that's going on immediately right there. Or it could be something that's still going on. You know, I am happy. I started being happy about, 4 hours ago when I had my first cup of coffee. But then I'm going to get tired later, maybe a little grumpy, and the happiness will stop. We'd still use the present for this. We could also use the present for something like, I am a carpenter. That's something that at some point I got my carpentry certificate, and that's going to go on presumably until I die, or maybe stop, become arthritic, stop being a carpenter. All these are things that we can express with the present. All right, so the present has a wide variety of things, more than just one single dot on the line, right? And if we were talking about some of our other tenses, I know this is review, but it's worth talking about. The imperfect is something that happened in the past, either continuously, maybe repeatedly, something that had a number of individual items. And that was how we expressed it, and we drew a distinction between the imperfect and the aorist, which was a single action sometime in the past. An asteroid hitting, it was raining, imperfect, when the asteroid hit the Earth. One big cataclysmic aorist, all right? If you had multiple aorists, the asteroids kept hitting the Earth, well then that's not aorist anymore. That's imperfect because it's repeated. It's the exact same sort of thing we have going on there. So these were the distinctions that we knew. And future has some interesting things to say about aspect too, but we can avoid those right now. Let's get finally to our actual perfect. So it's going to be different from the imperfect, right? I mean, that's why they have different names. And what does perfect mean even? Perfect helps if I spell it correctly. Well, this is coming from the Latin word, I can write out perfectum, that's the neuter form. And this is coming from a combination of a kind of particle, an adverbial thing, thoroughly, and then originally facio, but we get an ablaut, the vowel changes when it's combined, but that doesn't really mean anything. This means thoroughly to do thoroughly, to complete. And complete's really the thing we want to think of here. That's the essential aspect notion of the perfect. It's completed action. So when we say something's perfect, in English we might now think that means ideal, complete from a kind of aesthetic standpoint. But literally speaking in terms of the language, the Latin perfectum, this means completed. So let's see what that's going to look like on a chart. Let's use a kind of blue for the perfect. So perfect, that's white there, but let's make it blue. So it's a completed action, so that's not going to be something that's necessarily instantaneous. I think a good example is a building. So we think, I'm in Salt Lake City at the University of Utah. You think about the famous Mormon temple that we've got in our city. It's beautiful. It took years to build. They were taking granite from a faraway place, bringing it in here, building this long building. I forget the exact dates, but let's say it took 30 years to build. So let's say now that this time of utterance right now is when I'm speaking, 2014. So we're going to say, okay, this is 1800, this is 1900, and at some point, and this is not drawn to scale, they start building. They lay the first cornerstone, and they're building the temple, they're building the temple, they're building the temple. I think it's finished right before 1900. So the temple has been built. which is nice. It's brought a lot of tourists here. It's a sight to see. They've got beautiful flowers. It's been built. It has been built. So this is not only perfect. In English, we do perfect with a form of the verb to have. It's passive because we could say more actively the Latter-day Saints. That probably should be capitalized, but it's lowercase here. The Latter-day Saints have built the temple. They've actually built many temples around the world now. But this is the idea. There was a completed action. If we want to chart this, that's 30 years or so. And it's done now. They've done it. But if you show up in Salt Lake City today, 2014, the temple still stands. It's still relevant. It's a completed action in the past. The building's perfect. It's been completed. But it's still standing. If it were an aorist, we would just say, well, the last cornerstone was laid. Okay. And then we would have an aorist tense, and we could put that right there. I guess it wouldn't be a cornerstone if it was last, but they laid the cornerstone in, say, 1850. It's later than that. They put the angel statue on top in 1898. I'm not sure, again, that these dates are probably terribly wrong. That's not important. But we could say those would be aorist actions, simple. But this ongoing action of having built a building which still stands and can be seen today, that's the essence of the perfect. So what does that mean? What kind of tense is the perfect? We've talked about this is its aspect. So if we want to think about the difference between tense and aspect, tense here is going to be the white stuff. It's the absolute or relative time, relative to the time of utterance. What aspect will be is much closer to this blue stuff that's around. The form that it takes, a continued action with kind of relevance toward the present. That's the tense aspect distinction with the perfect. All right, that's all well and good. Let's erase this and start over. I'm sorry to be belaboring this. I mean, now we're like 12 minutes on with just charts. We haven't even gotten to the forms yet. But this stuff is important. Let's go back to a plain XY chart, and we can redraw the perfect. So again, time of utterance, t equals 0, when the speaker is speaking. Let's choose a different form of blue for our perfected action. It took a while to build, took a while to complete. Now it's got relative action. All right, good. So this is the perfect. Completed action in the past with present relevance. Note, as we'll get into it later, this is a primary tense. It's not secondary, and it takes no augment. This is surprising, at least at first, because we think, well, if it happens back here on the left side of this line, whether it's imperfect or aorist, those things all took a past indicative augment, a PIA. The perfect, why would it not? Because the action's happening in the past just the same. Well, the answer why it doesn't and why it's primary is it's got present relevance. It's all about this arrow. So I've got a meta arrow here, an arrow pointing at an arrow. But that's what makes the perfect the perfect. So let's say then, for the sake of argument, I were to erase the y-axis. So what I was saying before is that in 2014, the temple has been built. Now, let's imagine future aliens watching this in 2300. So, 300 years from now, a little less. Let's make it exactly 300 years from now. We'll make it 2314. If anyone's watching this now in the future, I'm sorry, there's better things from the present to be paying attention to. But you found me, so hello from the past. All right. Now, looking back at this chart, we have the same idea. The aspect is the same, a continued action with relevance pointing to a future date. But this date is now itself in the past. This is 2014. That's 300 years before what's going to be the new t equals 0, the time of utterance in 2013, or 2314 rather. This scenario, where it's exactly the same as the perfect, but it's been cast into the past. In essence, we've moved the y-axis forward. This is what we call the pluperfect in Greek. So it was completed action in the deep past that was still relevant at a time in the future. Let's say, I don't want this to happen in any shape or form, but there's a giant earthquake along the Wasatch Front. The temple collapses. It's built with like 12-foot walls. It's not going to collapse. But if it were to collapse, and then there's no more temple come 2314, historians can write, the temple had been completed by 2014. In 2014, the temple had been. And that's the way that we'll do the passive pluperfect, had been. Remember, the perfect was has been, but to set that in a further back time, we use had been for the passive, or for the active, it'd be had blanked, had completed. The Latter-day Saints had completed the temple by 2014. That's the pluperfect. And because of this, because we're talking all about past time, it's both a secondary sequence, like the optative, like the imperfect, like the aorist in the indicative, and this is an indicative form, and it is past indicative augment friendly. So we'll get into the forms very shortly, but this was a lesson. Now I see this is relevant to sections 1 and 2. I'm going to save the actual forms for another lesson, but this gave you an overview of the difference between the perfect system. So let's talk about that again. Perfect, we call it a tense, but really what we're talking about is aspect. We're talking about this notion, completed action. But of course these things do have tense because we are talking about, in the perfect, it's really a present tense, and I'll use that with asterisks around. It's a present tense verb because it's talking about present relevance of some completed action. That's why it's primary, that's why it takes no augment, but it's a completely different kind of meaning of completed action than we normally had seen with the present. The pluperfect, however, is a past tense. It's secondary, it takes an augment, and it takes the same aspect, the same completed action with later relevance, but it projects it all into the past, and this can often be a useful thing. So that wraps us up conceptually. Come back in the next lesson for actual charts and graphs. Well, no graphs anymore, just charts of how to actually form the forms. See you then.